Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about um, the review article, Neural Processing of Dynamic Emotional Facial Expressions in Psychopaths. This has actually been a huge interest of mine for a while because I think it's like crazy how their brain works when it comes to processing um, emotions and facial features in other people. So, for a bit of an introduction, so, why are facial expressions so important? Why is facial expression processing important? Well, they play a huge role in our social interactions because facial expressions convey social and affective information. So, when we see the faces of other people, it elicits a response in us, and that can also serve as an adaptive function. So, here, portions of the middle occipital gyri and the fusiform gyrus and the superior temporal sulcus, that's the core system of face processing, and face detection involves the pulvinar, superior colliculus, and the amygdala. And expression, gaze, and other like variable aspects of stuff that changes, like our expressions change, our eye gaze changes. Um, these are processed by the superior temporal sulcus up here, and then also the inferior frontal gyrus, which will be important in this study as well. Um, but what we're most focused on in the study is the emotional and affective processing of information. And the two key players in that will be looked at in this study more is the amygdala and the insula. Additionally, in healthy and normal individuals, processing emotions in other people is an important and regular function of everyday life. There's a social emotional response that is induced in humans by the perception of another person's emotions, and that's known as empathy. Like, when we're little kids and someone on the playground is hurt, we can understand that they're in pain and want to help them. So that's a social and emotional response. Hopefully, that will be how you would react. But empathy is so important, especially when someone is in need or they're vulnerable, and it's fundamental to all of our emotional experiences and all of our social interactions. I mean, how could we function if we couldn't understand what other people were feeling? And empathy is also fundamental to pro social behavior. It's also a key component in antisocial behavior, meaning that there is a dysfunction in empathetic abilities in antisocial personality, or in antisocial behavior. So psychopaths have been studied and have been proven to lack empathetic abilities, and they do exhibit antisocial behavior. Studies have shown that what I do as a normal individual, they can't. They have deficits in emotion perception and recognition. So, and I don't. So these pathways in the brain, in this diagram, something is dysfunctional in psychopaths. In other studies, it has been especially true if the emotion is fear and or sadness. We're gonna kind of unpack that as I go through the study today. And if those distress cues aren't processed, it's not going to contribute to the development of their empathy. So the atypical emotional processing clearly contributes to the dysfunction of empathy in psychopathy. So, what is the hypothesis in this study? So, researchers predicted that participants who scored high on the psychopathy scale would show reduced activation in affect specific nodes of the face processing network. And so, what was their like main goal for the study? Um, the main goal of the study was to examine whether the deficits in psychopaths' perception of emotion are specific to just fear, or are they more pervasive across all emotions. And they're going to really be able to unpack this because they're going to use a whole range of emotional expressions. So the methods and the participants, So the participants included 80 incarcerated adult males between the ages of 18 and 50. I wish females had been included in this because then, it could have extended to, the female gender too, but this is just male specific. And they volunteered to be part of the study, and they also received money as a incentive. Before entering the study, the inmates had to complete a number of assessments. So they needed their demographic information, IQ testing, and other psychiatric disorder testing. And then they underwent the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or the PCLR. And once they got their scores back, they were divided into 3 experimental groups. Those who had a score of 30 or above on the PCLR were assigned to the high psychopathy group. Those who had a score between 21 and 29 were in the medium psychopathy group, and those who scored at or below 20 were in the low psychopathy group, which were their low score controls. And I kind of wanted to include examples of questions that are on the PCLR. I'm characterized by shallow emotional responses. I'm a pathological liar. I'm overly impulsive. I lack empathy and am callous. And the participants, for each statement, they would say whether it applied to them, it did not apply to them, or it kind of did, kind of didn't. They weren't exactly sure. So for the fMRI imaging and the task design, so the participants were scanned with an fMRI while viewing dynamic stimuli of expressive faces in order to probe the already known characterized brain networks related to facial emotional processing in healthy adults. The researchers chose to use dynamic clips instead of like static just pictures, because they thought that by showing a dynamic display, it would give them more information and good context about what the expressions were. So they were presented with 64 video stimuli of actors expressing these emotions of happiness, fear, sadness, and pain. The clips were 2.2 seconds in duration and were followed by a baseline stimulus that was designed to control for motion, color, brightness, and basic composition. So like after doing a dynamic clip, they would see the baseline, activation would go down, then they could see the jump in the difference between the baseline and then the emotion. And then their gaze in the scanner was monitored via an infrared camera, so they could make sure that they're paying attention to the emotions. So for the results of the image processing and analysis, so the color scales from yellow to red are for increasingly negative t-values, and then green to blue for increasingly positive t-values from the baseline to the expression. And in this study, individuals scoring high on the psychopathy had consistently less activation than controls in all relevant brain regions during the viewing of the clips of happy, fear, sad, and pain expressions. All 4 facial expressions evoked greater activation in the controls than in the psychopaths in the face processing network, including the fusiform gyrus, as well as the extended network of the inferior frontal gyrus. So we can see that like group-wise, they tend to have higher scores than the factor 1, which is the high scoring group. They tended to have higher activation for the most part, except for certain areas, which I'll impact a little bit more. This imaging analysis, it doesn't support a fear-specific deficit, but it is consistent in the psychopath group that the fusiform gyrus was less responsive to happy and fearful faces, and then the STS was less active in the left hemisphere to sad faces and less active to expressions of pain. So results, so they only had 2 charts of brain regions. They had one for the amygdala and one for the inferior frontal gyrus. So for the amygdala, the response in the amygdala was statistically equivalent between groups for all categories of emotion except for happy faces. There was no significant differences in the left amygdala to any expression set or in the right amygdala in response to fear, sadness, or pain. Both high-scoring psychopaths and the low-scoring controls exhibited significant amygdala activation to most expression categories. And this was somewhat surprising, but it could be due to the fact that they chose to use dynamic stimuli rather than just static pictures. So the results for the this is for the insula, but I wanted to quickly talk about the inferior frontal gyrus. So the inferior frontal gyrus, this was the group that had the most consistent group differences during the perception of emotion, and it showed significantly less activity in the psychopath group for all 4 expressions. The implications of this, especially because it was not originally an area of interest, highlights it as a region of interest for future investigations of psychopathy and the role of this region in emotional processing. So for the insula, this was also an area of interest that I talked about in the very beginning of this. The response of the insula was positively correlated with scores on the PCLR, and it was the most consistently activated region across all studies of empathy or pain. So this makes sense because gray matter reduction has been observed in the insula in individuals scoring high on psychopathy tests. Thus, finding a heightened response in individuals who are characterized as lacking empathy might sound surprising, but this further supports the idea that increased activity in the insula supports the response modulation hypothesis, meaning that engagement of emotional processing in psychopaths may extend to other emotions besides fear. But it also can mean that this response in the insula reflects a non-specific increase in arousal or a specific negative affective reaction that doesn't even reach emotional awareness. So for the conclusion, the fMRI data does not support a specific dysfunction in psychopathy in the perception of facial expression of fear. This is really surprising because most studies tend to go with this conclusion, but rather all data found in the study is consistent with the view that emotion perception deficits in psychopathy are pervasive across all emotions, and also activation in the insula and inferior frontal gyrus could in cognition and emotion could have important implications for research on psychopathy in the future. And that is my reference.